Prince Philip did not live with Queen Elizabeth II. Instead, he chose a modest five-bedroom farmhouse.
For 73 years, Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth II were presented to the world as one of the most enduring partnerships in modern history. They stood together at coronations, state funerals, jubilees, and countless overseas tours. Yet in the last chapter of Philip's life, something changed that puzzled outsiders and fed 1,000 tabloid headlines. The Duke of Edinburgh, husband of the reigning monarch, was no longer living under the same roof as his wife for much of the year. He had moved into a modest five-bedroom farmhouse on the edge of the Sandringham estate, more than 100 miles from Buckingham Palace, while Elizabeth remained at the center of royal life in London and Windsor. To many, this looked like the quiet unraveling of a marriage. To those who actually understood the rhythms of royal life and the personalities of the two people at the center of it, it was nothing of the sort. It was instead the logical and rather moving final act of a partnership that had always balanced duty with individuality. This is the story of Wood Farm, the cottage that became Philip's sanctuary, and the surprisingly practical reasons why one of history's most famous couples chose, in their final years, to live apart while remaining as devoted to each other as ever. Long before anyone had heard of Wood Farm, Philip and Elizabeth had already built their marriage around a degree of separateness that might surprise people today. From the very beginning of their life together, the couple did not share a bedroom in the way most modern couples do. Instead, they kept adjoining bedrooms connected by a shared door, arrangement common among the British aristocracy for generations. This was not a symptom of estrangement. It was simply how their social class had long organized domestic life. Having a room of one's own meant a full night's sleep undisturbed by a partner's restlessness, snoring, or different schedule, while the connecting door meant that closeness was never more than a few steps away. Couples of Philip and Elizabeth's background often describe the arrangement not as distance, but as a form of consideration, a way of protecting the relationship from the small irritations that can wear away at daily life, while preserving the choice to be close whenever they wanted to be. When the newly married couple moved into Clarence House in 1949, this was exactly how their private quarters were arranged: separate but adjoining bedrooms, allowing togetherness on their own terms. As Elizabeth's role evolved from princess to reigning monarch after her father's death in 1952, and as the family shifted between Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and Balmoral, the same basic principle followed them everywhere. Wherever they stayed, Philip and Elizabeth kept their own private spaces. It is worth pausing on this because it reframes everything that came later. The separate living arrangement of Philip's final years was not a sudden or shocking departure from how the marriage had always worked. It was, in many ways, simply an extension of a habit the couple had practiced since their wedding night. The scale had changed. Instead of 2 bedrooms in the same wing, it eventually became 2 residences several hours apart. But the underlying philosophy that love does not require total physical merging of 2 lives, and that respecting a partner's need for personal space can strengthen, rather than weaken a marriage, remained constant across 7 decades. To understand why Philip chose Wood Farm specifically, it helps to know what the place actually was, and how long it had already mattered to the family before he ever thought of retiring there. Wood Farm sits in a secluded wooded corner of the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, close to the coast, and roughly 2 miles from the grand main house that most people picture when they think of the royal family's Norfolk retreat. It is a modest red brick, L-shaped farmhouse with 5 bedrooms, comfortable, but nowhere near the scale of a palace. It predates the royal family's ownership of the estate, originally functioning as an ordinary farm building before Sandringham was acquired by the Crown in the 19th century. The house carries a somber piece of royal history. In the early 20th century, King George V and Queen Mary sent their youngest son, Prince John, to live there. The young prince suffered from severe epilepsy, and in an era when such conditions were treated with secrecy and shame rather than compassion, he was kept largely away from public life. He died at Wood Farm in 1919 at just 13 years old, cared for mainly by his nanny. For decades afterward, the house passed through more mundane use, including as a residence for the family's estate physician. It was Elizabeth and Philip's generation that gave Wood Farm a second, gentler identity. The family began using it regularly from 1967, and it was Philip himself who saw its practical appeal, a place where family and guests could stay informally, without the enormous staff, cost and ceremony that came with the main house. Over the following decades, Wood Farm quietly became the family's favorite private escape. A young Prince Charles hosted shooting weekends there during his student years. Diana Spencer stayed at the cottage before her engagement to Charles was announced. Decades later, Catherine Middleton visited Wood Farm early in her relationship with Prince William, during a low-key stay at Sandringham designed to keep her out of the public eye. For a family whose lives were otherwise lived under constant observation, Wood Farm offered something rare: real privacy. So when Philip eventually chose the house as his retirement home, he wasn't picking an unfamiliar hideaway at random. He was returning to a place he had helped shape, one already woven into 50 years of family memory. In May 2017, Buckingham Palace announced that Prince Philip would step back from public engagements later that year. That August, at the age of 96, he carried out his final solo royal engagement, a parade at Buckingham Palace, involving the Royal Marines, the organization he had served as Captain General for decades. It brought to a close a public service career that had spanned more than 6 decades and included, by the palace's own tally, over 22,000 solo engagements since his wife's coronation in 1952. By any reasonable measure, Philip had earned a rest. The question was where he would take it. Buckingham Palace, with its hundreds of rooms and constant flow of staff, official business and formal function, was never going to be a retirement home in any real sense. It was, and remains, primarily a working palace. Windsor Castle, while a genuine family residence, still carried the weight of ceremony and the machinery of monarchy close at hand. Sandringham House itself, the grand main building on the Norfolk estate, was grander than what a man looking for quiet and simplicity might want. Philip chose Wood Farm instead. It was small enough to run without a large staff, secluded enough to offer real privacy, and familiar enough to already feel like his. After moving in, he set about making the cottage genuinely his own, overseeing the installation of a new kitchen, redesigning parts of the interior, and hanging his own watercolor paintings on the walls. Reports at the time noted that staff at Wood Farm did not wear the formal uniforms typical of the main royal residences, and that the Queen herself, on visits, would help with ordinary domestic tasks like cooking and washing dishes, a detail that says as much about the atmosphere Philip built there as any description could. From 2017 until the early months of 2020, Wood Farm functioned as Philip's primary home. Here, freed from the rigid choreography of royal duty that had defined his adult life since his wife's succession, he settled into pursuits that had little room in a schedule built around ribbon cuttings and state visits. He painted watercolors, a hobby he'd rarely had time to properly enjoy during his working decades. He read widely and kept up correspondence with friends. He reportedly took an interest in a small truffle-growing operation on the grounds. He hosted friends informally, in a way that would have been almost impossible inside the walls of a working palace. The other half of this story is Elizabeth, and it's easy to overlook just how demanding her role remained throughout this period. Unlike Philip, the Queen did not have the option of stepping back. The British monarchy does not really allow for a reigning sovereign to retire. The role continues, by constitutional design, until death. Even in her 90s, Elizabeth kept up a punishing schedule that included weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, state papers that required her daily attention regardless of location, investitures, receptions, and a calendar of engagements that would have exhausted people decades younger. This meant that, practically speaking, Elizabeth's life had to remain centered where the machinery of monarchy actually operated, principally Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, both close to the political and ceremonial heart of the country. Philip, on the other hand, had no such obligation pulling him toward London. His official duties were over. There was no longer any institutional reason for him to keep pace with a palace routine built around his wife's unceasing responsibilities. Seen this way, the arrangement that emerged after 2017 wasn't a marriage drifting apart. It was two people whose circumstances had simply diverged after retirement, each living in the place that made the most sense for the life they were actually leading. Elizabeth managed the machinery of state from London and Windsor. Philip enjoyed a well-earned rest in Norfolk, and crucially, this was not the same as losing touch with one another. The Queen visited Wood Farm regularly, often more frequently than press coverage at the time suggested, and the two spoke by phone in between. Distance in their case did not mean disconnection. It's worth dwelling on the texture of Philip's daily life during these years, because it stands in such contrast to almost everything that came before it. Here was a man who, for nearly 7 decades, had walked a symbolic half-step behind his wife at every public appearance, a position dictated by protocol, reflecting the fact that his wife, not he, held constitutional authority. He had given up a promising career in the Royal Navy, one he had genuinely loved, to take on the role of consort after Elizabeth's unexpectedly early accession to the throne in 1952. For the rest of his working life, his public identity was largely defined in relation to hers. At Wood Farm, for the first time in decades, Philip's days were organized entirely around his own interests, rather than a public schedule set by the palace's press office. Biographers and royal commentators who have written about this period describe a man who genuinely relished the informality of it all, a retirement home without the trappings that had surrounded him his whole adult life. The absence of uniformed staff, the Queen doing her own washing up during visits, Philip pottering in the garden or at his easel, all of it painted a picture of a couple stripped, for a few precious years, of the performance that public life had always demanded of them. This is perhaps the most human part of the story. After a lifetime lived largely in service of an institution, Philip got to spend his final active years simply being a person with hobbies, quiet routines, and the freedom to shape his own days. Elizabeth, for her part, seems to have not only accepted this, but actively supported it, visiting often, and by several accounts finding genuine peace in the ordinary domesticity of those visits, a contrast to the ceremonial weight of her day-to-day duties elsewhere. This arrangement, settled and comfortable as it had become, was upended almost overnight in March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic reached Britain. Philip, then 98 years old, fell squarely into the highest risk category for the virus. With Wood Farm's smaller staff and more remote setting, suddenly less appealing from a safety standpoint, the calculus shifted, and Philip relocated to join Elizabeth at Windsor Castle. For the first time in years, the couple were living under one roof full-time. Royal commentators nicknamed the arrangement HMS Bubble, a nod to Philip's naval background and to the tightly sealed, minimal-staff household the couple maintained during lockdown. In many ways, it became one of the most sustained, uninterrupted stretches of time the two had spent together in decades, a strange silver lining to an otherwise frightening global crisis. Freed from the pull of separate schedules and separate homes, if only by necessity, they weathered the pandemic's early, most uncertain months side by side. Philip's health, however, was clearly declining by this stage. He experienced multiple hospital stays over the following months, including a lengthy admission in early 2021 that combined treatment for an infection with management of a pre-existing heart condition. He returned to Windsor Castle in March 2021, and it was there, rather than at his beloved Wood Farm, that he died on April 9, 2021, at the age of 99. In the weeks and months that followed his death, Elizabeth returned to Wood Farm several times. Reports from that period describe her flying by helicopter to Sandringham and staying at the cottage, rather than the grander main house nearby, a choice that says a great deal about what the farmhouse had come to mean to her. It is understood she intended to remain at Sandringham through early February, timed to the anniversary of her own father's death, in keeping with a long-standing pattern of royal mourning tied to that estate. Choosing to stay at Philip's cottage rather than the main house wasn't about avoiding memories. It was closer to the opposite, an active choice to be surrounded by them. Wood Farm held some of the most private, unguarded years of their marriage, the version of their relationship least filtered through protocol and public performance. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life performing a role in public, that cottage represented something rare, a place where she and her husband had simply been a married couple, doing ordinary things, largely unobserved. Elizabeth herself died on September 8, 2022, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, a little under a year and a half after Philip. Their marriage, which had begun in 1947, had lasted 73 years by the time it ended, the longest of any British monarch in history.